Welcome to Moonlight Story. This is a quiet space where you can slow down at the end of the day and listen to gentle stories created to help your mind relax and drift into sleep. So, wherever you are right now, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed or resting somewhere warm and quiet. Allow your shoulders to soften. Take a slow breath in through your nose and gently breathe out. Let the day fade a little more with every breath. Tonight's story is about a peaceful, rainy evening where Lucy spends some quiet time in her kitchen, slowly baking an apple pie using her grandmother's old recipe. It's a simple, cozy moment, filled with the soft sound of rain outside, the warmth of the kitchen, and the comforting smell of apples and cinnamon baking in the oven. So settle in, relax your body, and allow your mind to slow down. And when you're ready, we can begin tonight's story. The rain had been falling since late afternoon. Not heavy, not stormy, just steady. By the time Lucy reached home, the sky had already turned a soft gray blue. The streets outside her building shimmered under thin sheets of water. Tiny ripples formed wherever droplets landed. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. The apartment greeted her with stillness. She closed the door gently behind her and stood there for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. It had been a long day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth telling a story about. Just small things. Conversations that took too much energy. Tasks that felt heavier than they should have. A quiet kind of tiredness that sits in the shoulders. Lucy slipped off her shoes and placed them neatly by the door. She hung her coat, smoothing the sleeves out of habit. The air inside felt slightly cool. She walked to the kitchen and turned on the small overhead light above the counter. A warm glow spread slowly across the room, softening the corners. Outside, rain traced gentle lines down the glass. Lucy filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove. The soft click of the burner lighting made the kitchen feel more alive. She leaned her palms against the counter and took a slow breath. Some evenings call for quiet. Some evenings call for something warm from the oven. She already knew which recipe she would choose. There was a small wooden drawer beside the refrigerator. It stuck slightly when opened, and she always had to pull it with a gentle tug. Inside, tied with a thin cream ribbon, was a bundle of recipe cards. They weren't fancy. Some were written on thick cardstock. Others were cut from old notebooks. A few had small stains from years ago. Flower fingerprints, drops of oil, faded pencil corrections. Lucy untied the ribbons slowly and began flipping through them. Her fingers paused when she saw familiar handwriting. Neat. Rounded letters, confident strokes. Her grandmother's writing. She slid the card out carefully. Apple cinnamon pie. Lucy ran her thumb lightly over the title, as if greeting it. She remembered sitting at the small kitchen table years ago, watching her grandmother measure flour without ever using a leveler, watching her slice apples in even, effortless motions. The pie had always been made on rainy days, or on days when something didn't go quite right, or sometimes for no reason at all. Lucy placed the card on the counter and read through it once, even though she already knew the steps by heart. 2 cups of flour, cold butter, a pinch of salt, apples, cinnamon, sugar. Simple. That's what she liked about it. No complicated techniques, just steady hands and patience. The kettle began to hum softly behind her, steam barely visible in the dim kitchen light. Lucy turned it off before it whistled. She wasn't ready for tea yet. She just wanted the warmth lingering in the air. She tied her hair back loosely and washed her hands, letting warm water run over her fingers a little longer than necessary. When she dried them, she felt ready. She walked to the pantry first. The flour container was heavier than she expected. She carried it carefully and set it on the counter. Then sugar. Then a small glass jar of cinnamon. When she opened it briefly, the scent rose up gently, warm and familiar. From the refrigerator, she took out a block of butter, cold and firm. She placed everything neatly in a row. Flour, butter, sugar, cinnamon. Then she turned toward the fruit bowl sitting near the window. The apples were still slightly cool from the morning air. Smooth skins, deep red fading into yellow near the stems. She picked them up one by one, checking their firmness the way her grandmother once taught her. 5 apples would be enough. She set them beside the other ingredients. Outside, rain continued to fall. Inside, the kitchen felt calmer already. Lucy pulled a large mixing bowl from the cabinet. The ceramic was cool in her hands. She placed it on the counter and stood still for just a moment. The world outside felt distant now. The only sounds were rain, the faint hum of appliances, and her own steady breathing. She looked again at the recipe card. Then she reached for the flour and began. Lucy scooped flour into a measuring cup. She leveled it gently with the back of a knife, then poured it into the large ceramic bowl. The flour settled softly, forming a pale mound in the center. She repeated the motion once more. 2 full cups. A small pinch of salt followed. Just enough. She stirred the dry ingredients together with her fingers. Light circles through the flour. Slow and even. Then she reached for the butter. It was still cold from the refrigerator. Firm. She cut it into small cubes on a wooden board. The knife pressed down with a soft, steady sound. Each cube was added into the bowl. Small squares of pale yellow against white flour. Lucy dusted her fingertips lightly in flour. Then she began pressing the butter into the flour, lifting, rubbing, letting it fall back into the bowl. Again and again. The mixture slowly changed texture. From loose flour to soft crumbs, tiny bits of butter coated in flour. She worked patiently, not rushing the process. Every few moments, she lifted the bowl slightly and tilted it, letting the crumbs shift. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm. Soft against the windows. After several minutes, the mixture felt ready. Coarse, light, evenly blended. Lucy poured a small amount of cold water into a cup. She added it slowly, 1 spoonful at a time. After each spoonful, She gently brought the dough together with her hands, pressing lightly, turning the bowl slightly as she worked. The crumbs began to hold, not sticky, not wet, just soft enough to gather. She pressed it into a rough ball. The surface wasn't perfectly smooth, but it held its shape. Lucy placed the dough onto the counter. She shaped it gently into a flat disc, using the palm of her hand to smooth the edges. She wrapped it carefully in parchment paper, then placed it in the refrigerator to rest. The quiet hum of the fridge welcomed it. Lucy wiped her hands on a clean cloth. A faint dusting of flour still lingered on the counter. She brushed it away slowly. The kitchen felt warmer now. The soft overhead light reflected gently off the countertop. Outside, the rain seemed steadier. She glanced at the recipe card once more. The dough would rest for a while. That was part of the rhythm. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Lucy leaned against the counter for a moment, listening. The quiet, the rain. Then she turned toward the apples waiting by the window and began preparing the filling. Lucy pulled the apples closer to the counter and picked up the first one. It felt cool in her hand. She reached for the small peeler in the drawer and began removing the skin in slow strips. The peel curled away from the apple and fell lightly onto the cutting board. She turned the apple slowly as she worked, letting the blade glide just under the surface. When the last piece of peel came off, the apple looked pale and smooth. She set it aside and picked up the next one. The same quiet motion repeated, the peeler moving in steady circles, the thin red strips gathering on the board. Soon a small pile of apple peels had formed. Lucy sliced the first apple in half and removed the core. Then she cut each half into thin slices, placing them into a large bowl beside her. The slices landed softly, one after another. She continued with the rest of the apples. Peel, slice, add them to the bowl. By the time she finished, the bowl was nearly full. The apples were pale and slightly glossy from their fresh-cut surfaces. Lucy reached for the sugar and sprinkled a few spoonfuls over the apples. Then she opened the small jar of cinnamon. The scent rose immediately, warm and familiar. She tapped a small amount over the apples and watched the brown powder fall across the slices. Using both hands, She gently turned the apples so the sugar and cinnamon coated them evenly. Some slices slid against the sides of the bowl, while others settled deeper into the pile. She mixed them slowly until the cinnamon was spread throughout. The apples began to release a little moisture, creating a light syrup at the bottom of the bowl. Lucy left the bowl on the counter and wiped the cutting board clean. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, steady against the glass. She glanced toward the refrigerator and took the dough out. The parchment paper was slightly cool when she unwrapped it. She placed the dough onto the counter and dusted the surface lightly with flour. Then she picked up the rolling pin. With slow pressure, she rolled the dough forward, then back again. The dough began to widen with each pass of the rolling pin. She turned it slightly and rolled again, keeping the shape as even as she could. A light dusting of flour kept it from sticking. Soon the dough was wide enough to fit the pie dish. Lucy lifted it carefully and laid it into the dish, pressing it gently along the bottom and sides. The edges rested slightly over the rim. She picked up the bowl of apples and began filling the crust. One spoonful at a time, she spread the slices across the base. Some pieces overlapped while others settled naturally into place. When the bowl was empty, the pie was full and rounded slightly in the center. Lucy stepped back for a moment and looked at it. Then she reached for the remaining piece of dough that would become the top crust. Lucy picked up the remaining piece of dough and placed it on the lightly floured counter. She dusted a little more flour across the top and reached for the rolling pin again. Slowly, she rolled the dough forward. Then she pulled the rolling pin back toward her. With each pass, the dough began to widen. She turned it slightly and rolled again, smoothing the surface and keeping the thickness even. After a few more gentle passes, the dough had spread wide enough to cover the pie. Lucy carefully lifted it with both hands and brought it over the pie dish. She lowered it slowly over the apples, letting the dough settle across the rounded surface. The edges hung softly over the sides of the dish. Using her fingers, she pressed the top and bottom crusts together along the rim. She worked her way around the pie, sealing the edges and folding the extra dough inward. Then she used her thumb and finger to crimp the crust, creating small ridges all the way around. When she finished, she reached for a small knife and cut a few simple slits in the center of the crust. Thin openings where steam could escape while the pie baked. Lucy looked at the pie for a moment, making sure everything was in place. Then she carried the dish to the oven. The oven was already warm. She opened the door and slid the pie carefully onto the middle rack. The oven door closed with a soft click. Lucy brushed a little flour from her hands and leaned lightly against the counter. The kitchen felt warm and quiet. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows. After a moment, she walked over to the coffee machine. She filled it with water and added a few scoops of ground coffee. The lid closed gently. When she pressed the button, the machine hummed softly as it began to brew. Lucy took her favorite mug from the shelf and set it on the counter. The smell of coffee slowly began to fill the kitchen. She walked over to the window and rested her hands along the edge of the sink. The rain fell steadily outside, running in small trails down the glass. The streetlights reflected softly on the wet pavement. Lucy stood there quietly, watching the rain and listening to the gentle sounds in the kitchen. Behind her, the coffee machine finished brewing. She poured the warm coffee into her mug and wrapped both hands around it. The mug felt warm against her fingers. Lucy carried it to the small table near the window and sat down. The kitchen was peaceful. Just the soft rain outside and the pie slowly baking in the oven. Lucy sat quietly at the small table near the window, holding her warm mug between both hands. The heat from the coffee slowly spread through her fingers. Outside, the rain continued falling in a steady rhythm against the glass. She lifted the mug and took a small sip. The coffee was warm and comforting. Lucy set the mug back down and leaned back slightly in her chair. The kitchen lights cast a soft glow across the counter. Everything felt calm. Behind her, the oven worked quietly as the pie baked. Soon a faint, sweet smell began to drift through the kitchen. Warm apples, cinnamon, and buttery pastry slowly filling the air. Lucy glanced toward the oven and smiled to herself. She stayed seated for a moment longer, enjoying the warmth of the kitchen. The rain outside had grown a little softer now. Gentle drops tapping against the window. Lucy finished another sip of her coffee and stood up slowly. She walked back toward the counter and rinsed the small knife she had used earlier. Water ran softly into the sink. She dried the knife with a towel and placed it back in the drawer. The kitchen was tidy again. Lucy glanced at the clock on the wall. The pie still had a little time left in the oven. She returned to the window and looked outside once more. The street was quiet. Rainwater shimmered beneath the streetlights. Every now and then, a car passed slowly along the wet road. Lucy wrapped her arms loosely around herself and listened to the quiet sounds of the evening. The rain, the faint hum of the oven, the occasional creak of the house settling. After a while, the oven timer gave a soft chime. Lucy turned and walked over to the oven. She opened the door carefully. A wave of warm air filled the kitchen. The pie looked golden on top. Small bubbles of apple filling gently rising through the slits in the crust. Lucy slipped on a pair of oven mitts and carefully lifted the pie out. She placed it on the counter. The crust crackled softly as it cooled. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the entire kitchen now. Lucy removed the oven mitts and rested her hands on the counter beside the pie. For a moment, she simply stood there, enjoying the warmth and the quiet evening around her. Lucy let the pie rest on the counter while the warmth slowly faded from the pan. The crust had turned a soft golden color, and the smell of apples and cinnamon still filled the kitchen. She walked to the cabinet and took down a small plate. Then she picked up a knife and carefully cut a simple slice from the pie. The crust gave a gentle crack as the knife moved through it. Warm apple filling slowly settled back into place. Lucy lifted the slice and placed it onto the plate. A little steam still rose from the center. She carried the plate back to the table by the window and sat down again. Outside, the rain was still falling, but it had softened into a gentle, steady drizzle. The streetlights glowed warmly through the wet glass. Lucy took a small bite of the pie. The apples were soft, sweet, and warm with cinnamon. She smiled quietly and took another small bite. For a while, she simply sat there, enjoying the quiet moment. The house felt peaceful. Rain tapping softly against the windows. The faint warmth from the oven slowly fading in the kitchen. Lucy finished the last bite and set the plate aside. She rinsed it in the sink and left it to dry beside the faucet. The pie remained on the counter, cooling slowly for later. Lucy turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow from the lamp near the window. The room felt dim and calm. She picked up her mug and walked slowly toward the hallway. Before leaving, she glanced back once more at the quiet kitchen. The pie on the counter. The rain outside the window. Everything warm and peaceful. Lucy smiled softly to herself and switched off the last light. The house grew quiet. Outside, the rain continued to fall gently through the night.